The morning sun had barely touched the horizon when Lieutenant Commander Emily Hayes stepped onto the naval base. The crisp air carried the scent of salt water, diesel, and early morning drills, a scent familiar to anyone who had spent more than a few weeks in the Navy. Emily's boots clicked against the concrete as she made her way toward the mess hall. She moved with the quiet assurance of someone who had walked through war zones in foreign lands, someone who had learned to read the smallest details, to anticipate the unseen. To the casual observer, she appeared calm, even ordinary, almost invisible amid the sea of young, eager trainees hustling toward breakfast. But anyone looking closely might notice the sharpness in her gaze, the way her eyes scanned every movement, noting weaknesses, habits, and tells. Inside the mess hall, the chatter of trainees filled the air. Plastic trays clattered against tables, the smell of eggs and coffee mingling with the echo of laughter and conversation. The room was alive with energy, but also with bravado, the kind of bravado that came from youth and untested confidence. Emily walked past long rows of tables, each occupied by a group of trainees, comparing last night's workout results, joking about their drill instructor, and whispering rumors about the new officer. She moved with deliberate slowness, letting her presence be noticed without drawing unnecessary attention. A few heads turned, curious about the woman whose uniform was impeccable and whose calm, almost statuesque demeanor contrasted sharply with the restless energy around her. Most of the young men assumed she was just another logistics officer or administrator, someone there to observe, record, or enforce minor rules. They didn't know what she had endured, the missions flown over enemy territory, the nights spent crawling through mud and darkness, the missions that required patience, endurance, and cold calculation. Emily had been part of classified operations around the globe, yet here she chose to blend in, to observe. She was a student of human behavior as much as she was a master of combat. Her training as a Navy SEAL had taught her that the quiet ones were often the deadliest, the ones underestimated. And today, in this mess hall, that lesson was about to play out in the most unexpected way. Emily carried her tray of breakfast to a small, unoccupied table near the corner of the room. She placed it down with practiced precision, making sure every utensil and item was arranged neatly, almost ritualistically. The clatter of trays and chatter of trainees continued around her, but she seemed untouched by it, immersed in her own world. Some trainees glanced her way and then returned to their conversation, misjudging her composure as timidness, a quiet vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Derek, the informal leader of a group of 4 particularly cocky trainees, noticed her first. He nudged Mason, his closest friend, and whispered loudly enough for the others to hear, "Check her out. Think she could handle SEAL training?" Mason laughed, a nervous edge in his tone, while Tyler and Cruz exchanged smirks, their youthful pride already gearing them up for a bit of harmless teasing. They had no idea who Emily was. Emily, sensing their gaze, did not react. She ate slowly, deliberately, stirring her coffee as she listened to the conversation. Her calm exterior hid the sharp alertness within every word, every glance, every subtle movement registered in her mind. She had faced ambushes far deadlier than a cafeteria confrontation, and yet she knew that sometimes the battlefield came in unexpected forms. Today, it was 4 overconfident young men, and she would teach them lessons far more valuable than brute force alone. The mess hall staff busied themselves, refilling trays and clearing dishes, occasionally stealing glances at the new officer. Whispers floated across the room. Is she one of the instructors? Does she even know how to handle herself? Emily ignored the speculation, keeping her movements deliberate, her calm unwavering. In her mind, she was already analyzing the 4 trainees, reading their posture, their micro-expressions, noting overconfidence, hesitancy, and bravado. All the classic signs of inexperience, all the subtle tells that could be exploited with precision. Derek, emboldened by his friend's laughter, finally approached, leaning slightly over Emily's table. "Hey, ma'am," he said with a grin. "You look kind of out of place. You sure you belong here?" The words were meant to provoke, to challenge, to test the waters. Emily looked up slowly, her gaze steady and unwavering. She measured the young man's stance, his tone, the tension in his shoulders. "You'd be surprised what I've seen," she replied quietly. There was no anger in her voice, no arrogance, just the calm certainty of someone who had endured far more than he could imagine. For a moment, Derek laughed, mistaking the silence for fear or uncertainty. "Sure, right," he said, smirking at his friends. "Bet she's never even done a real workout in the field." His laughter drew the attention of nearby trainees, who watched the scene with interest. Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she continued to eat her breakfast, her movements deliberate and controlled. But the room's energy shifted imperceptibly. Some trainees leaned closer, sensing tension, while others whispered speculations. Emily's eyes, sharp and unrelenting, followed the four men as they tried to assert dominance through words alone. She didn't need to speak louder, move faster, or display aggression. The mere presence of experience, of controlled power, radiated from her. Emily had learned long ago that confrontation often begins quietly. Before every mission, she studied her environment, analyzed potential threats, and waited for the exact moment to act. The mess hall, though not a battlefield in the traditional sense, was no different. She had taught thousands of recruits, mentored countless soldiers, and faced countless challenges. Yet every encounter demanded respect, strategy, and composure. As the four trainees continued their teasing, Emily remained a picture of calm control. She finished her meal without haste, setting down her utensils with precision, each movement purposeful. The small acts of composure, so mundane to an untrained eye, were in fact signals of mastery. To the casual observer, she was quiet, almost timid, but every micro-expression told a different story to someone who understood true skill. By the time she rose to leave, a subtle hush had spread across the room. Trainees whispered among themselves, some curious, some apprehensive. Emily's next move would set the tone for what was about to unfold, what would later be remembered as the 45-second lesson that transformed arrogance into humility. As she walked toward the exit, every eye in the mess hall followed her, unaware that the quiet officer they had underestimated was about to reveal the lethal precision of a Navy SEAL. The tension in the room was electric. This wasn't just breakfast anymore. This was a lesson, unfolding silently before any physical movement even began. Emily Hayes had arrived, calm, composed, unassuming, and the storm she carried was about to change four young men forever. The hum of the mess hall was punctuated by the laughter of young men who thought themselves untouchable. Derek, Mason, Tyler, and Cruz leaned back in their chairs, chests puffed out, as if the weight of their collective confidence could intimidate the world. They were veterans of the gym, of late-night wrestling matches, of weekend hiking challenges that felt like mountains of conquest. Yet here, in the presence of Lieutenant Commander Emily Hayes, all their bravado was about to meet its first real test. Derek nudged Mason and smirked. "Check her out," he whispered loudly enough for the others at their table to hear. "Do you think she could even survive SEAL training?" Mason laughed, though nervously, the joke masking an instinctive sense that Emily was far from ordinary. Tyler and Cruz exchanged a glance, both unconsciously straightening in their seats, as if to project strength they didn't entirely feel. They didn't yet know that Emily had trained in conditions far harsher than anything their imaginations could conjure. Weeks without sleep, days without food, hostile terrain, and enemy forces ready to exploit any weakness. Emily sipped her coffee calmly, listening. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was observation. Every posture, every twitch of muscle, every nervous glance was being catalogued in her mind. She could tell Derek was overconfident. Tyler had a flash of doubt behind his bravado. Mason relied too much on his physicality, and Cruz, though quiet, had a streak of defiance that might be useful or dangerous. The four men were like children waving sticks at a lion, unaware of the strength contained within the calm predator watching them. "Ma'am," Derek said, leaning forward, his tone half teasing, half challenging. "You sure you belong here? SEAL training isn't exactly cozy." His friend snickered, clearly expecting Emily to squirm or retreat. The mess hall seemed to hold its breath, the chatter dimming as a few trainees began to notice the silent tension. Emily set her cup down deliberately, her movements slow, controlled, purposeful. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't yell. Her eyes, calm yet piercing, met Derek's, locking him in a gaze that was neither confrontational nor afraid. "You'd be surprised what I've done," she said quietly. There was no threat, no boasting, just a statement of fact. The words themselves were enough to make the four men pause, even if only for a fraction of a second. In the world of combat, half a second could be the difference between life and death, a lesson she had lived 1,000 times over. Derek's smirk faltered slightly. "Oh yeah?" he said, trying to recover, his pride flaring like a small flame against a cold wind. "I bet you've never even—" He stopped mid-sentence, sensing the weight behind Emily's eyes, the quiet authority that didn't demand respect, it commanded it. He looked to his friends, hoping for some backup, but they too were feeling the unease creeping into their confidence. Mason shifted in his seat, Tyler's grin wavered, and Cruz's defiance started to flicker like a candle in a gust. The atmosphere in the mess hall had changed. What had begun as playful arrogance was morphing into something more precarious. Other trainees watched with curiosity, whispers rippling through the room. "Who is she?" "I think she's a real SEAL." Emily didn't need to answer. Her presence alone spoke volumes. The commanding officer, standing near the edge of the hall, observed silently, noting how one quiet officer had begun to exert influence without a single act of physical dominance. Emily's movements were deliberate as she finished her breakfast. She wiped her hands, picked up her tray, and rose to leave. Her height, posture, and calm gaze created an invisible barrier, a force field of authority that made the four trainees suddenly aware of their own vulnerability. Derek's ego rebelled, unwilling to accept defeat, even silently. "We're not scared," he muttered under his breath, more to convince himself than anyone else. As Emily walked toward the door, she paused, just enough to glance back. Her eyes caught each of the four men in turn, reading them like an open book. There was excitement, yes, but there was also fear, hesitation, and overconfidence teetering dangerously close to arrogance. "If you want to test me," she said softly, her voice calm, steady, and low enough for only them to hear, "come find me in the mat room. I'll show you what real control looks like." For a moment, the four men stared, processing the words. Their laughter, which had once filled the mess hall with careless bravado, faltered. Mason opened his mouth to respond, but found no word suitable. Tyler and Cruz exchanged nervous glances, while Derek, the loudest of them all, tried to mask unease with a shaky grin. The commanding officer stepped closer, curiosity written across his face. He had heard the exchange, and now understood why Emily Hayes was being watched so intently. It was one thing to be a decorated officer. It was another to carry a reputation so quietly, so completely, that even the brashest trainees felt it pressing down on them without a single aggressive gesture. Whispers spread across the mess hall. Other trainees speculated about Emily's history, her skills, her past missions. Rumors and imagination filled the gaps, none of which could possibly match reality. But that was irrelevant. What mattered was the effect she had on those 4 young men who had assumed they could intimidate anyone, anywhere. Their overconfidence had blinded them to the fact that mastery often arrived quietly, without warning, and with a calm presence that was far more lethal than any shout or display of force. The 4 trainees left their table, muttering excuses to each other. The mess hall seemed to pulse with the tension they carried, the sense that something significant was about to happen. They moved toward the mat room, their steps tentative, their bravado faltering. Emily's voice followed them, calm, measured. "I'll be waiting." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. As they disappeared around the corner, the room slowly returned to its normal rhythm, though the effect lingered. Trainees exchanged glances, some with admiration, others with unease. Emily returned to her own space, finishing her drink, her eyes alert but relaxed. She had made her point without lifting a hand, without raising her voice, without demonstrating physical skill. The lesson had begun. For Emily, this was only the first act. She understood the psychology of the untested, of youthful arrogance, of misplaced pride. Today, she would teach not only combat skills, but a lesson in respect, control, and humility. And in less than an hour, the 4 young men who had tried to corner her in the mess hall would learn the cost of underestimating someone who had survived far greater challenges than they could ever imagine. By the time Emily Hayes left the mess hall that morning, she was already planning the next steps, mentally rehearsing the movements, counters, and techniques that would demonstrate not only skill but mastery. She had faced enemies in foreign lands, trained soldiers under extreme conditions, and endured trials designed to break even the strongest. These 4 young men were nothing by comparison, but the lesson she intended to teach would stick with them longer than any physical defeat they might have imagined. The tension that began with casual teasing had now transformed into anticipation, a quiet storm building just below the surface. Emily's calm eyes, steady posture, and subtle authority had done what few instructors could. She had commanded respect without raising her voice, had created awe without a show of force, and had prepared the battlefield in her mind, ready for the moment when words would turn into action. And in the mat room, waiting just beyond the corner, she knew the moment of truth was approaching. 45 seconds would change everything, and the trainees would never forget the quiet officer they had mocked over breakfast, the one they had underestimated entirely. The mat room was quieter than the mess hall had ever been. The usual echo of bouncing balls, grunts from trainees, and instructors' whistles was replaced by the tense hum of anticipation. Emily Hayes stepped inside, carrying herself with the same deliberate calm that had unnerved the 4 trainees earlier. Derek, Mason, Tyler, and Cruz followed, their steps faltering slightly as the reality of the upcoming confrontation settled over them. Their earlier bravado had dissipated into a mix of curiosity, fear, and stubborn pride. They had thought Emily was just another officer, perhaps even someone they could intimidate. They were wrong. Emily placed her tray on a nearby bench, then slowly removed her jacket, revealing the unmistakable gold trident of a Navy SEAL pinned to her chest. The room seemed to pause. Derek's jaw dropped slightly, Tyler blinked rapidly, and Mason's confident stance wavered. Cruz, the quietest of the 4, felt his defiance faltering under the weight of her calm intensity. The trident wasn't just a symbol, it was proof. Proof that the woman they had underestimated was trained to face situations they couldn't imagine. Emily's voice broke the silence, soft but clear. "All 4 of you. Attack together. Don't hold back." The words were not shouted, not exaggerated. They carried authority in their simplicity. The commanding officer, who had quietly followed the group from the mess hall, nodded approvingly from a corner. He had seen trainees intimidated before, but never in a way that required no show of aggression. Emily's presence alone was the lesson. The 4 trainees glanced at each other, hesitation flickering in their eyes. They were strong, well-trained for their age, and confident in their physical skills, but they were about to meet experience that dwarfed their ego. Derek stepped forward first, the natural leader, trying to mask his nervousness with a forced grin. "All right, let's see what you've got," he said. Emily's eyes didn't flinch. She shifted slightly, her weight balanced, muscles ready but relaxed. She knew exactly what each trainee would do, anticipated every move before it happened. Combat was as much a mental game as a physical one, and she had mastered both. The 4 men lunged, their combined energy rushing toward her, expecting her to struggle, expecting her to falter. What they didn't anticipate was the precision that had been honed over years of high-risk missions. The first attack came from Derek, a fast, determined push aimed to overwhelm her. Emily shifted her weight just slightly, redirecting his momentum and using it against him. He stumbled forward, his center of gravity lost, and she guided him to the mat with a gentle but firm motion that belied the force behind it. The other 3 hesitated, startled at how easily their leader had been neutralized. Mason attacked next, swinging wide, hoping to take her by surprise. Emily sidestepped fluidly, her movements smooth as water, and applied a subtle wrist lock that forced him to the ground. Mason gasped, realizing that his strength, which had been his pride, was useless against Emily's controlled skill. Tyler tried a different tactic, circling around with a feint to the left, aiming to catch her off guard. Emily anticipated the move, pivoting and intercepting him with a technique so precise it left him flat on his back, staring at the ceiling in disbelief. Cruz hesitated at first, uncertainty clouding his mind. He had watched his friends fall in moments and felt the adrenaline spike through him. He rushed forward, a surge of youthful recklessness, only to meet Emily's calm force. She redirected his momentum with a single fluid motion, pinning him gently but firmly. Cruz felt the reality hit him. Strength without skill, aggression without control, was meaningless. Less than 45 seconds had passed. All 4 trainees were on the mat, panting, eyes wide, hearts racing. They had underestimated her. Every muscle in their bodies screamed disbelief, their minds trying to reconcile the quiet woman from the mess hall with the SEAL, who had just dominated them with surgical precision. Emily took a slow step back, breathing steady, voice calm. "Lesson 1, she said softly. Never underestimate the quiet ones." The room was silent, except for the labored breathing of the 4 trainees. The commanding officer stepped forward, nodding, his approval unmistakable. "That's why she's a SEAL," he said quietly. The words carried weight. This wasn't about humiliation. This was about respect, about demonstrating mastery in a way that would be remembered far longer than any bruises or physical pain. Emily helped each trainee to their feet in turn. She didn't scold them or belittle them. Instead, she offered a quiet, steadying hand and a few words of instruction. "Strength is not about arrogance," she said. "It's about control, precision, and patience. If you let ego dictate your actions, you'll be outmatched every time." Her tone was firm, yet not harsh. She was teaching, guiding, and correcting in the same moment. Derek, once the loudest, now avoided direct eye contact. Mason rubbed his sore wrist, a newfound humility settling in. Tyler's pride had cracked, replaced by the realization that his physical skill alone was insufficient. Cruz, though shaken, felt a spark of respect ignite within him. He had glimpsed the calm force behind Emily's eyes, the patience, the focus, the quiet strength that required no show of ego. The atmosphere in the mat room shifted from tension to awe. Trainees and instructors alike watched, realizing that what they had just witnessed was more than a display of skill. It was a lesson in discipline, control, and respect. Emily's mastery of her body and mind had turned what could have been a moment of embarrassment into a profound teaching experience. Word of the 45-second lesson spread quickly throughout the base. Trainees who hadn't been present at the mat room told stories in hushed, reverent tones. It was no longer just about a young officer confronting 4 overconfident men. It was about the quiet SEAL who had reminded everyone that true strength is measured by control, not aggression, and skill, not bravado. In the following days, Emily continued her work with the trainees, not with fear, but with respect and guidance. She became a mentor, her presence commanding attention and discipline. The 4 trainees, once brash and careless, trained harder, listened more closely, and approached every task with humility. They had learned a lesson that could not be taught in books, drills, or lectures. That mastery is quiet, and power is most dangerous when understated. For Emily, the 45-second confrontation was merely another day, another demonstration of what she had learned in years of combat and survival. For the 4 trainees, it was a turning point, a lesson in respect, skill, and the humility required to survive not only in training, but in the field. By the end of that day, the mat room had transformed from a place of physical exercise into a space of learning, reflection, and reverence. Emily Hayes had shown that true leadership doesn't require loud words, nor does it rely on ego. It relies on calm, measured action, precise skill, and an unwavering understanding of both human nature and physical mastery. And for the 4 young men who had cornered her in the mess hall, that 45-second encounter would remain etched in their memories forever, a lesson in humility, respect, and the quiet power of a true Navy SEAL. The room was quiet, heavy with tension and disbelief. The 4 trainees, Derek, Mason, Tyler, and Cruz, were still catching their breath on the mat, their bodies trembling slightly from exertion, their minds reeling from the whirlwind of movement they had just experienced. What had been intended as a casual confrontation had transformed into an unforgettable lesson. For 45 seconds, Emily Hayes had moved with the precision of a predator, neutralizing 4 fully grown, fit young men with effortless efficiency. It was not merely the speed or the technique that stunned them. It was her calm, her control, the absolute absence of unnecessary aggression. She had not yelled, not swung wildly, not relied on brute strength alone. Every movement had been measured, deliberate, perfectly calculated. In her presence, they felt the weight of experience pressing down on them, a quiet force that dwarfed their confidence. Emily paused, breathing steady, and took a small step back. Her gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of each trainee in turn. "Lesson 1, she said softly. "Never underestimate the quiet ones." The words were almost casual, yet they carried authority and finality. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to demand respect. It had already been earned in the silent language of mastery. The commanding officer, who had silently observed from the corner, stepped forward. He had seen many trainees over the years, many confrontations, many lessons in discipline. But few moments had matched the impact of this one. "That," he said quietly, "is why she's a SEAL." His approval carried weight, not only for the trainees who had challenged her, but for everyone watching. This was a teaching moment, a demonstration of control, skill, and respect. Derek slowly rose to his feet, chest heaving, pride wounded, but slowly replaced by awe. For the first time, he understood the meaning of underestimation. "I didn't expect that," he admitted, voice low. Mason, brushing sweat from his brow, nodded silently, humbled. Tyler and Cruz exchanged glances, both realizing that they had misjudged her completely. The arrogance that had once defined them was now replaced by a mixture of humility and admiration. Emily walked toward them, her steps deliberate but calm. She crouched slightly to help Cruz to his feet, offering a steady hand. "Strength," she said, her voice gentle but firm, is not about showing off. It's about control, precision, patience. Ego has no place in true skill. Her words were not criticism. They were guidance, a lesson that would linger far longer than the physical exertion on the mat. The 4 trainees absorbed her words, some silently, some nodding slightly. Their bodies still bore the memory of the swift, efficient movements that had neutralized them. Their pride had been tested, broken, and reformed into something more disciplined. They had confronted someone they assumed was weaker, only to discover that real power does not announce itself. It reveals itself in moments of truth, often when least expected. Around the mat room, other trainees who had gathered to watch murmured among themselves. The story had already begun to spread. "Did you see that?" One whispered. "All 4 of them in 45 seconds. And she barely moved?" Another added. "She's a SEAL, isn't she? That trident on her uniform." The whispers were a mix of fear, awe, and admiration. Emily had transformed from a quiet observer to a living example of discipline and mastery. The commanding officer spoke again, his voice low but firm. "Remember this moment. Not because she defeated you, because she taught you. True skill doesn't require anger. True strength doesn't demand recognition. She showed you control, precision, and respect. Learn it, carry it, and pass it on." His words sank in, cementing the lesson far beyond what physical confrontation could have achieved. Emily stepped back, giving the trainees space. She observed them carefully, noting their posture, their breathing, the subtle shifts in their attitude. Derek was no longer cocky. Mason's confidence was tempered by humility. Tyler's defiance had been replaced by curiosity. Cruz's quiet stubbornness had transformed into cautious respect. Each had learned something essential in those 45 seconds. Mastery begins with self-control, continues with awareness, and culminates in respect for oneself and for others. For Emily, this was not about ego or dominance. It was about teaching, about imparting a lesson that could not be found in books or manuals. She had lived through countless challenges, from hostile terrains to high-stakes missions, and she knew that physical skill alone was insufficient. Discipline, composure, and mental fortitude were what separated success from failure, life from death. The mat room had become a classroom, and these 4 trainees had just received one of the most important lessons of their lives. She moved toward the mat where Derek had fallen, crouching down slightly to meet him at eye level. "You have talent," she said quietly, "but talent without control is dangerous to yourself and others. Remember this." Her gaze was steady, unyielding, yet compassionate. Derek swallowed, nodding slowly. He had expected humiliation, perhaps even ridicule, but what he received instead was respect and instruction, far more profound impact than any insult or confrontation could have delivered. Mason, recovering from his stumble, met her gaze. "I understand," he said, voice low but sincere. Tyler and Cruz mirrored him, each internalizing the lesson in their own way. The room, once filled with tension and overconfidence, now carried a sense of awe and reflection. Emily had not only demonstrated skill, she had inspired a transformation. Outside the mat room, whispers had spread throughout the base. Trainees spoke of the 45-second encounter in hushed tones, describing not just the speed and precision, but the calm authority that had defined Emily's movements. It was no longer just a story about physical dominance. It was a story about respect, mastery, and the quiet power of discipline. Emily finally stood, surveying the room. The trainees were no longer 4 arrogant youths. They were students, learners, and future operators with a new understanding of what it meant to respect skill, control, and composure. She did not gloat. She did not demand praise. Her lesson had been delivered with quiet efficiency, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The commanding officer stepped forward once more. "You will remember this lesson," he said, addressing the room. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was fast, but because it teaches what no book or drill can. Discipline, precision, and respect, these are the foundations of true skill. And this officer has just demonstrated them perfectly. The trainees absorbed the words, some silently, some nodding in agreement. Emily's eyes, calm yet unyielding, scanned the room one last time. She had entered the mat room to teach a lesson, and she had done so without a single act of unnecessary force. The lesson would resonate far longer than the physical exertion of the encounter. For Derek, Mason, Tyler, and Cruz, the memory of Emily Hayes, the quiet officer who had defeated them in 45 seconds, would remain indelible. It was a moment of transformation, a turning point that reshaped their understanding of strength, skill, and respect. They had underestimated her, as many before them had, and now they carried the lesson forward, not as humiliation, but as guidance for the rest of their training and their lives. As Emily left the mat room, the commanding officer followed. "She's remarkable," he said quietly. "And you've just witnessed why respect is earned, not demanded." Emily nodded, her expression calm, yet carrying the subtle weight of experience that only those who had faced life-and-death situations could possess. Outside, the base resumed its rhythm, but something had changed. Trainees walked taller, spoke quieter, and observed more carefully. The story of the quiet Navy SEAL, who had humbled 4 overconfident young men in 45 seconds, was already becoming legend. And Emily Hayes, the officer who carried both skill and humility, would continue to teach, guide, and inspire one lesson, one trainee, one transformation at a time. The mat room was silent, except for the sound of shallow breaths, the rustle of clothing, and the faint creak of the mats underfoot. Derek, Mason, Tyler, and Cruz were ready, or at least they thought they were. Confidence brimming, hearts pounding with adrenaline. They believed their combined strength and youthful energy could overwhelm the quiet officer before them. They were wrong. Lieutenant Commander Emily Hayes, standing calmly in front of them, radiated a stillness that belied the storm beneath her composed exterior. Her stance was simple, precise, deliberate, feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, weight evenly distributed. Her eyes, sharp and unflinching, scanned the 4 men simultaneously, measuring their posture, reading their intentions, anticipating their moves. Every twitch, every micro-shift in their muscles, every breath they drew told her more than words ever could. She had trained for years to read the body language of opponents before a single strike was thrown. And these 4 men were textbook examples of arrogance, overconfidence, and miscalculation. Derek, the leader of the group, lunged first, his arms extended, trying to overwhelm her with sheer force. Emily shifted her weight just enough to redirect his momentum, a smooth, fluid motion honed over countless missions. In an instant, she guided him to the mat, using his own energy against him. Derek's eyes widened in disbelief as he hit the floor, realizing that raw strength alone was futile. Mason reacted next, swinging his arms with a desperate attempt to capitalize on Derek's fall. Emily sidestepped effortlessly, twisting his wrist in a controlled lock, and Mason collapsed to the mat, breathless and humbled. Tyler tried a different approach, circling and feinting to throw her off balance. Emily anticipated the move, pivoting and intercepting with precise timing. A quick sweep of her leg, and Tyler found himself flat on his back, staring at the ceiling in stunned silence. Cruz, hesitant at first, finally charged, a mix of fear and determination propelling him forward. Emily met him with the same calm efficiency, redirecting his momentum and pinning him gently but firmly. In less than 45 seconds, all 4 trainees were on the mat, gasping, sweating, and struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The room seemed to hold its breath. The commanding officer, who had been observing silently, allowed a faint smile to break across his face. "That's why she's a SEAL," he muttered quietly, knowing full well that the lesson extended far beyond physical skill. Emily stood, breathing evenly, every muscle relaxed yet ready, a calm predator surveying her domain. She took a deliberate step back and addressed the trainees. "Lesson 1, she said softly, her voice steady and unshakable. "Never underestimate the quiet ones." There was no sarcasm, no mockery, only clarity, authority, and experience distilled into a few words. The trainees' minds raced, trying to process the sudden shift from perceived control to total humbling in less than a minute. Derek slowly lifted his head, eyes wide, chest heaving. I didn't expect that," he admitted, voice tinged with awe and disbelief. Mason rubbed his sore wrist, the reality settling in that his physical prowess had been neutralized by technique and timing. Tyler shook his head, speechless, while Cruz, still pinned lightly to the mat, finally exhaled, a spark of respect igniting within him. The arrogance that had fueled their confidence moments ago had evaporated, replaced by a mixture of humility, awe, and a hunger to learn. Emily walked toward Derek, crouching slightly to meet his gaze. "Strength is useless without control," she said gently but firmly. "Precision matters. Discipline matters. Ego is your worst enemy in any challenge, and I've seen far too many fail because they ignored it." Derek swallowed hard, nodding, absorbing her words. For the first time, he realized that power was not measured in brute force, but in control, awareness, and the ability to act decisively and calmly. Mason rose, still rubbing his wrist, and looked at Emily with a newfound respect. "I understand," he muttered, voice low but sincere. Tyler and Cruz mirrored him, each processing the lesson differently, yet all recognizing the undeniable truth. Emily Hayes had demonstrated what they could not, even at the peak of their physical confidence. The commanding officer stepped closer, his voice low but carrying authority. "Remember this moment," he said to the group. "Not because you were defeated, but because you witnessed mastery. Mastery does not scream. It does not boast. It acts with precision, control, and purpose. And that lesson is worth far more than any victory you could have imagined." His words reinforced the profound impact of the 45-second display, ensuring it would remain etched in their minds. Around the room, other trainees had gathered to witness the aftermath. They spoke in hushed tones, recounting what they had just seen. The speed, the technique, the calmness, the authority. It wasn't just about physical skill. It was about presence, awareness, and the quiet power of someone who had trained beyond the limits of ordinary expectation. Emily had turned a confrontation into a lesson, and the entire room had absorbed it, knowingly or not. Emily continued to address the trainees, moving deliberately among them. "Each of you has potential," she said, voice calm but unwavering. "But potential without discipline is wasted. Power without control is dangerous. Remember this, and every time you step onto the mat or into the field, carry this lesson with you. Respect skill, respect control, respect those who have earned mastery, and you will survive and thrive where others fail." The trainees nodded slowly, the initial shock giving way to reflection. Derek, once brash and overconfident, had learned humility. Mason's physical pride was tempered by awareness. Tyler and Cruz carried a mixture of respect and resolve, understanding that their previous assumptions had been dangerously flawed. In 45 seconds, Emily had not only neutralized their physical attacks, but had reshaped their attitudes, leaving an imprint far stronger than any bruise or sore muscle could create. The commanding officer observed quietly, satisfied that the lesson had been delivered in its purest form. No shouting, no punishment, no unnecessary aggression, just precision, timing, and authority. Emily Hayes had not only demonstrated her skill, but had imparted wisdom that would resonate long after the trainees left the mat room. Even after the physical confrontation ended, its effects lingered. Trainees spoke of the 45-second encounter with awe and reverence, recounting every movement, every subtle adjustment, every moment of control. Emily's calm demeanor, the ease with which she neutralized all four men, and the quiet authority of her presence had transformed what could have been a simple lesson into a defining moment. By the end of the session, the four trainees had transformed. They walked taller, spoke with measured tone, and approached their training with a new understanding of what it meant to respect skill, discipline, and experience. They had learned in 45 seconds that mastery was silent, understated, and far more powerful than any boast or display of arrogance. For Emily, the lesson was routine, another demonstration of skill, honed over years of training, missions, and life-or-death experiences. For the trainees, it was life-changing. They had confronted a quiet, unassuming officer and learned a lesson that would shape their approach to training, teamwork, and life in ways that no lecture or book could have imparted. The mat room had become more than a space for physical training. It had become a classroom, a theater of transformation. Emily Hayes had turned a potential confrontation into an endearing lesson in respect, discipline, and the quiet force of mastery. And for the four trainees who had challenged her, the memory of 45 seconds would remain with them forever, a benchmark of skill, humility, and the silent power of a Navy SEAL. The mat room had quieted, but the impact of the 45-second confrontation lingered in the air like an electric charge. Derek, Mason, Tyler, and Cruz sat on the mats, catching their breath, eyes wide, and still processing the events. Their muscles burned, not just from exertion, but from the shock of having their assumptions completely overturned. They had come in brimming with confidence, expecting to assert dominance over a new officer. Instead, they had met calm, controlled mastery that left them humbled and unexpectedly inspired. Emily Hayes stood near the edge of the mat, watching silently, breathing evenly, her eyes scanning the trainees as she assessed their reactions. She did not gloat. She did not mock. The lesson had been delivered in action, precise and undeniable. Now it was time for reflection. Discipline, she knew, was reinforced not by punishment, but by understanding. The trainees needed to internalize what they had just experienced, to turn shock into growth. Derek finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Ma'am, I didn't realize." He trailed off, words failing him. Emily didn't need him to finish. She simply nodded, allowing the silence to emphasize her point. Strength without control was dangerous. Ego without humility was fragile. Every moment of hesitation, every burst of reckless energy had been met with effortless redirection. Derek's mind raced as he replayed each movement, each subtle maneuver, recognizing how completely he had underestimated her. Mason, rubbing his wrist and flexing it cautiously, looked up at Emily. "I guess raw strength isn't enough," he muttered. His voice carried a mixture of humility and curiosity. Mason had always relied on physicality, his size, his power, his confidence, but now he saw a dimension of skill that went beyond brute force. Emily had shown him that strategy, timing, and precision were far more decisive than raw strength alone. Tyler and Cruz exchanged glances, both visibly affected. Tyler, who had tried to flank her, realized that instinctive aggression was no match for calculated calm. Cruz, the quietest and most defiant of the four, felt a spark of awe ignite within him. He had resisted the lesson at first, convinced that strength and speed were enough. But now, under Emily's watchful eyes, he understood a different kind of power, the kind that could not be taught in a gym, nor tested in simple drills. The commanding officer stepped forward, voice quiet but carrying authority. "You've just witnessed something important," he said. "Not just skill, but the application of discipline, control, and awareness." Notice how she didn't need to shout, didn't need to humiliate, didn't need to show off. Yet she taught a lesson more enduring than any punishment could. Remember that. His words sank deeply, embedding the principles Emily had demonstrated into the minds of the trainees. Emily finally approached the 4 young men. "Each of you has potential," she said, her voice calm and measured. "But potential without control is wasted. You have to respect your own limits, respect the skill of others, and understand the consequences of acting impulsively. That is what separates those who succeed from those who fail." Her gaze swept across the room, and she saw in their eyes a flicker of comprehension, of humility tempered with determination. For Derek, the lesson was personal. He had led the group with confidence and arrogance, thinking he could intimidate Emily with bravado. Now he realized that leadership required more than presence. It demanded awareness, patience, and respect for those with experience. Mason, too, internalized the truth that raw power was secondary to technique, strategy, and the mental edge. Tyler and Cruz were equally transformed, Tyler learning patience, Cruz understanding respect. The transformation did not end with the 4 trainees. Word of the 45-second demonstration spread quickly throughout the base. Trainees who had not been present at the mat room shared the story in whispers, careful not to exaggerate, yet struggling to convey the profound impact. "Did you see her?" one trainee asked another. "She didn't even break a sweat." All 4 of them down in under a minute. Others nodded, awe in their eyes. Emily Hayes' reputation was solidified, not as an intimidating officer, but as a figure of skill, composure, and authority. Over the next several days, subtle changes began to appear in the behavior of the 4 trainees. Derek approached his training sessions with newfound focus, listening intently to instructors and observing his peers with greater respect. Mason began integrating strategy into his routines rather than relying solely on strength. Tyler and Cruz displayed restraint and patience, learning to assess situations before reacting. Emily's lesson had gone beyond physical combat. It had shaped mindset, behavior, and approach to challenges. Emily herself did not linger to watch these changes. Her role was not to micromanage transformations, but to facilitate them. She continued her duties, observing from a distance, letting her trainees internalize the lesson in their own time. She knew that true mastery often required reflection, and she trusted that these 4 young men would carry the impact of those 45 seconds far beyond the mat room. The commanding officer observed quietly, pleased. "That's the mark of a great instructor," he said. "Not intimidation, not punishment. Impact through demonstration, calm authority, and skill. Those 4 will never forget this, and neither will anyone else who hears about it." Indeed, the story of the 45-second lesson became legendary on the base. It was repeated in hushed tones, a tale of respect, precision, and humility, an example of what it meant to be both strong and controlled. Even weeks later, Emily's influence was visible. The trainees she had taught exhibited higher levels of focus, respect, and teamwork. Other trainees who had witnessed or heard of the incident adjusted their behavior, aware that arrogance could be met with skill and composure far beyond their comprehension. Emily had not simply neutralized 4 overconfident young men. She had created a ripple effect that elevated the standards of the entire unit. The mat room itself became a symbol. It was no longer just a place for physical training. It was a space where lessons in discipline, control, and respect were delivered through action. Emily Hayes had transformed the environment through presence alone. Trainees came to observe, not with fear, but with curiosity, ready to learn from someone who embodied the very principles they aspired to achieve. The transformation of Derek, Mason, Tyler, and Cruz continued beyond the physical lessons. Derek's leadership evolved, tempered by humility and awareness. Mason's confidence was now paired with strategy and precision. Tyler developed patience, learning to anticipate rather than react. Cruz, the once defiant and quiet trainee, had gained a newfound respect for skill and discipline. Each carried the lesson forward, applying it not just in training, but in their daily conduct. Embodying the values Emily had demonstrated in action. For Emily, the aftermath was simply another part of her role. She had delivered the lesson with calm efficiency, allowed the trainees to reflect, and observed as their attitudes shifted. She knew that the true impact of her actions would extend far beyond the MAC rooming to field operations, teamwork exercises, and the lives of the young men she had mentored. 45 seconds had reshaped confidence into humility, recklessness into focus, arrogance into respect. And as the base continued its rhythm, Emily Hayes remained a figure of quiet authority, a living example of skill, composure, and mentorship. Her 45-second demonstration had become legend, a story that trainees would recount for years. But for her, it was simply another day, another lesson delivered, another opportunity to shape the next generation of Navy personnel with patience, precision, and unwavering mastery. By the end of the week, the ripple effects were undeniable. The 4 trainees were transformed, the base more disciplined, and Emily Hayes' reputation as a calm, precise, and highly skilled officer firmly cemented. She had shown that true mastery was quiet, deliberate, and impactful. In 45 seconds, she had not only neutralized a challenge, but also instilled a lesson that would resonate far beyond the mat room, a lesson in respect, discipline, and the enduring power of skill and control. The days following the 45-second encounter in the mat room were unlike any other on the base. Derek, Mason, Tyler, and Cruz moved through their routines with a newfound awareness. Every step they took, every decision they made, was tempered by the memory of Emily Hayes, her calm demeanor, her precision, and the way she had neutralized them effortlessly. It was as if a seed had been planted, growing steadily, reshaping not only their approach to training, but their very perception of strength, discipline, and leadership. Derek, the natural leader of the group, had always relied on confidence, loud assertions, and a belief in his own physical dominance. Now, however, he approached each task with careful observation, analyzing situations before acting. He listened more attentively to instructors, noted the movements of his peers, and began to anticipate challenges rather than rushing headlong into them. Where arrogance had once guided him, calculated awareness now took its place. In the mess hall, on the training field, and in the weight room, Derek's peers noticed a marked difference. His leadership was still present, but it carried a subtle, commanding authority rather than the brashness that had defined him before. Mason, whose pride had always been tied to his raw physicality, experienced a similar transformation. The wrist lock Emily had applied had left more than a physical mark. It had left an impression on his mind. Mason now paired strength with strategy, focusing on technique and efficiency. He watched and learned, taking careful notes of instructors' demonstrations, integrating subtle adjustments into his own practice. His peers began to rely on his strength, yes, but also on his emerging ability to apply it with precision, to think several steps ahead, and to execute without wasted motion. Tyler, the impulsive one, found patience in the aftermath of that brief yet unforgettable encounter. Where he had once relied on instinct, he now paused, assessed, and anticipated. Emily's calm efficiency had taught him that quick reactions without thought could be dangerous, not just physically but mentally. His movements became deliberate, measured, and far more effective. Tyler began mentoring other trainees subtly, sharing insights into how to combine instinct with control, earning the respect of both peers and instructors. Cruz, initially quiet and defiant, underwent perhaps the most profound transformation. He had resisted the lesson at first, convinced that Emily's calmness masked weakness. But now he understood that strength without discipline was hollow. Cruz began to approach training with a quiet determination, observing others, analyzing outcomes, and refining his own skills. His respect for Emily grew, not just as a demonstration of superiority, but as a model of what true mastery and leadership could look like. Where he had once resisted authority, he now embraced it with discernment, learning to separate ego from wisdom. Beyond the 4 trainees, Emily's influence began to ripple across the base. Others who had witnessed or heard of the 45-second encounter adjusted their own behavior. Arrogance gave way to curiosity, recklessness to measured decision-making. The story of Emily Hayes, the quiet officer who had neutralized 4 confident young men with calm precision, became a teaching tool referenced in drills, strategy sessions, and even casual discussions. Trainees began to understand that strength alone was insufficient. Observation, control, and mental discipline were equally critical. Emily did not micromanage these transformations. She allowed the trainees to discover lessons for themselves, stepping in only when guidance or correction was needed. Her approach was subtle, but effective small adjustments, gentle corrections, and leading by example rather than dictating every move. Her presence was enough to inspire respect and adherence to discipline, and her calm authority carried far more weight than any shout or reprimand could. The Mac room became a center of transformation. Trainees who had once approached exercises with overconfidence now entered with respect and preparation. Observers watched Emily demonstrate techniques, not for intimidation, but as a model of efficiency, control, and mastery. Every lesson reinforced the idea that discipline and respect were as important as physical skill, and that arrogance could be neutralized with focus and precision. For the 4 trainees, the transformation extended beyond physical skill and mental discipline. It began shaping their interactions with others. Derek led his peers with patience and awareness. Mason's guidance combined strength and strategy. Tyler offered insights into measured reactions. And Cruz quietly inspired respect through his steady determination. Each had internalized Emily's lessons, carrying forward the principles she had demonstrated in action. One afternoon, after weeks of training, the 4 gathered in the mat room to practice techniques they had observed Emily perform. Their movements were precise, controlled, and executed with focus rather than force. Derek took the lead, guiding his peers through the sequences they had learned. Mason applied the techniques with strength and strategy. Tyler adjusted his timing to match his instincts with precision. And Cruz maintained steady control over his movements. The 4 were no longer just trainees. They had become students of mastery, embodying the lessons Emily had imparted. Emily watched from the corner, her expression calm but observant. She saw the subtle changes, the refinement in their technique, the discipline in their movements. Her role was not to praise excessively or to spotlight their progress publicly. She simply allowed their improvement to manifest naturally. Each successful execution, each controlled motion, was a confirmation that her lesson had taken root. Over time, the story of the 45-second lesson became a cornerstone of training culture at the base. New trainees were told the story not as a warning, but as a teaching example. Mastery is quiet, instructors would say. Discipline speaks louder than ego, and respect for skill is earned, not assumed. Emily's demonstration became a symbol, a benchmark for what it meant to be truly prepared, both mentally and physically. The transformation extended beyond technique. The 4 trainees began to embody values that Emily had modeled: patience, awareness, respect, and composure. They approached challenges differently, anticipating rather than reacting, observing rather than assuming. The lessons of 45 seconds had transcended the physical confrontation and reshaped their character, teaching them humility, focus, and the importance of controlled action in high-stakes situations. Emily's influence did not stop with the four. Other trainees began emulating the principles she exemplified: calm authority, measured action, and disciplined focus. The base culture shifted subtly but noticeably. Training became less about displays of strength or dominance, and more about strategic thinking, observation, and controlled execution. Emily had turned a single brief encounter into a ripple of transformation affecting the entire unit. By the end of the month, Derek, Mason, Tyler, and Cruz were recognized not just for physical ability, but for the maturity and discipline they now exhibited. They were sought after as mentors by newer trainees, teaching them not only techniques, but also the mindset required to succeed. Emily Hayes had demonstrated skill, but more importantly, she had demonstrated the art of teaching through action, creating leaders who would carry her lessons forward long after she was no longer directly overseeing them. The mat room, once a place of raw exertion and casual bravado, had become a sanctuary of learning, reflection, and transformation. Emily Hayes had turned a moment of confrontation into a profound teaching experience, leaving an indelible mark on the four trainees and the broader training culture. Her quiet authority, precision, and calm composure had reshaped attitudes, instilled discipline, and created a legacy of respect and mastery. In the weeks and months that followed, the story of the 45-second encounter continued to inspire. Trainees spoke of it with reverence. New recruits learned of Emily's skill and calm authority, and the four men who had once cornered her carried the lessons forward in every aspect of their training. The transformation was complete, not just in skill, but in mindset, character, and the understanding of what true mastery meant. Emily Hayes remained the quiet force behind the transformation, a symbol of what discipline, skill, and calm authority could achieve. She had turned confrontation into opportunity, arrogance into humility, and raw potential into controlled mastery. And for the four trainees who had challenged her, the 45 seconds in the mat room became a defining moment, shaping their growth and leaving a legacy that would resonate long into the future. Months had passed since the 45-second encounter in the mat room, yet its effects continued to ripple across the base. The story of Emily Hayes, the quiet officer who had cornered four overconfident trainees and humbled them with calm precision, had become legend among the ranks. It was recounted not as a tale of intimidation, but as a lesson in discipline, respect, and the subtle yet formidable power of mastery. New recruits arrived aware of her reputation, and existing trainees approached her presence with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Derek, Mason, Tyler, and Cruz had become transformed versions of themselves. Their attitudes, once marked by ego, impulsiveness, and overconfidence, were now tempered by awareness, patience, and humility. Derek led his peers with measured authority, his once loud declarations replaced by calm instructions and strategic guidance. Mason applied his physical strength with precision and thoughtfulness, pairing his natural power with newly developed technique. Tyler's impulsive tendencies had been replaced by anticipation and control, while Cruz, once defiant and quiet, now exuded a steady confidence that inspired those around him. Each carried Emily's lesson in their own way, and together they became living examples of what discipline and controlled mastery could achieve. Emily continued her work quietly, observing from the sidelines as the trainees applied the lessons she had imparted. She offered guidance when necessary, small corrections, and strategic advice, but mostly she allowed the transformation to unfold naturally. Her role was not to dominate, but to empower, to show by example what true skill, composure, and leadership looked like. She knew that lasting lessons were never shouted. They were demonstrated, internalized, and reflected upon over time. The mat room, once a place of casual training and youthful bravado, had become a sanctuary of learning and reflection. Trainees who entered carried a sense of awareness and focus previously absent. They observed not only Emily's techniques, but also her demeanor, the calm authority, the patience, and the precision that defined her actions. Even small movements, small corrections, were infused with meaning, teaching lessons far beyond the surface of physical skill. Emily's influence reached beyond the mat room. Other instructors began to emulate her methods, adopting her calm, precise approach to mentorship. Physical drills were no longer merely about brute strength or speed. They became exercises in control, observation, and respect. The 45-second encounter had created a subtle but profound shift in the culture of the base, demonstrating that skill combined with discipline could shape behavior and mindset more effectively than force or intimidation. For the 4 trainees, the impact of Emily's lesson extended beyond their immediate training. Derek applied his newfound leadership skills in team exercises, observing and anticipating rather than dominating, earning the trust and respect of his peers. Mason's physical prowess became a tool for support and strategy rather than personal glory. Tyler's patience allowed him to excel in high-pressure exercises, and Cruz's quiet confidence inspired other trainees to approach challenges thoughtfully. They had internalized a simple truth. Mastery was not measured by ego or physical dominance, but by control, awareness, and respect. The story of Emily Hayes' 45-second lesson continued to be recounted in subtle ways throughout the base. Instructors shared it during briefings, trainees whispered it during downtime, and it became a benchmark for what true skill and discipline could look like. It was a story of humility, patience, and controlled mastery, a reminder that appearances were often misleading and that calm authority could be more powerful than aggression. Beyond the physical and tactical lessons, Emily had imparted something deeper, a model of leadership. She had shown that authority was not demanded, but earned. That respect was not commanded, but cultivated through example. Every trainee who observed her, whether directly or through stories, internalized the principles she embodied: precision, patience, awareness, and composure. These were lessons that would carry far beyond the walls of the mat room, into field operations, leadership roles, and life itself. The 4 trainees also became mentors themselves, sharing what they had learned with newer recruits. Derek, Mason, Tyler, and Cruz carried the memory of those 45 seconds, not as a tale of humiliation, but as a cornerstone lesson in humility, discipline, and skill. They emphasized that arrogance was a liability, impulsiveness a risk, and that careful observation and respect for experience were essential for survival and success. Emily's impact had multiplied, creating a culture of mentorship, reflection, and thoughtful growth. Emily Hayes herself remained a quiet presence, unassuming but profoundly influential. Her accomplishments as a Navy SEAL were respected, but it was her ability to teach through action an example that defined her legacy on the base. She did not seek recognition or praise. Her satisfaction came from seeing transformation in her trainees, from observing the ripple effects of a lesson that began in 45 seconds but lasted a lifetime. Even outside formal training, Emily's influence was apparent. Trainees approached challenges with careful thought, respecting not only their peers' abilities, but their own limits. Conflicts were resolved with observation and measured responses, rather than impulsive aggression. The values she embodied, discipline, precision, respect, and patience, became embedded in the daily life of the base, shaping behavior, teamwork, and leadership across the unit. As months turned into years, the legend of the 45-second encounter grew. New trainees arriving at the base were told the story, not as a warning, but as a lesson in excellence and composure. Respect those who have earned mastery, instructors would say. Learn from those who act with calm authority. Arrogance and impulsiveness are weaknesses, not strengths. Emily Hayes' example became a touchstone for what it meant to be a skilled operator, a disciplined leader, and a mentor of profound impact. For Derek, Mason, Tyler, and Cruz, The transformation was lasting. They carried the lessons of that day into advanced training, operations, and eventually leadership positions. Their growth was a testament to the power of example, the effectiveness of calm authority, and the importance of precision over force. Emily had shown them that true mastery did not need to announce itself. It revealed itself through deliberate, controlled action. The legacy of Emily Hayes extended far beyond the macro. She had shown that in 45 seconds, a lesson could be delivered that changed lives, shaped character, and influenced an entire training culture. Her calm, precise, and respectful approach to mentorship created leaders who understood that strength alone was insufficient, that patience and discipline were critical, and that respect earned, not demanded, was the foundation of any effective unit. In the end, a 45-second encounter was more than a story. It was a blueprint for excellence, a testament to the quiet, enduring power of skill, and a reminder that true leadership is measured not by domination, but by the ability to inspire, teach, and transform. Emily Hayes' legacy, built in the span of moments yet echoing for years, stood as a beacon of what it meant to be a Navy SEAL, a mentor, and a leader in every sense of the word. Asterisk.